In my 35 years on the bench here in Providence, Rhode Island, I've seen just about every version of human struggle you can imagine. I've seen single mothers come into this courtroom terrified because one unpaid parking ticket turned into three. I've seen young men standing in front of me pretending not to be afraid when you could see the fear all over their faces. I've seen grandmothers apologizing for mistakes they made just trying to survive. And over the years, one truth has never changed. The cases that look small on paper are often the ones that reveal the biggest truths about people. That's exactly why what happened one cold Thursday morning has stayed with me. Because on the surface, it looked like nothing more than a routine municipal case. A few tickets, a wealthy man, a short hearing. The kind of thing that most people assume ends with a fine, a signature, and everyone moving on with their lives. But that morning, something very different walked into my courtroom. That morning, Pride walked in wearing an expensive suit, and by the time it left, it had a very different face. Before I tell you what happened, let me say this. If you believe no amount of money should ever place someone above the law, leave a comment after you hear this story. Because what happened that day wasn't really about tickets. It wasn't even about punishment. It was about ego. It was about character. And it was about what happens when a man who has spent his whole life being obeyed suddenly finds himself in a room where money has no voice. My courtroom has never been about headlines. People know me because I try to look past the violation and see the human being standing behind it. That has always mattered to me. A ticket is paper. A person is a life. And if you don't understand the difference, you have no business sitting on a bench in judgment of anyone. That Thursday started like any other. The clerk had a stack of files ready for me, a few parking citations, some expired registrations, a speeding ticket or two. Nothing unusual. Inspector Quinn stood where he always stands, steady and alert, with that calm expression of a man who has seen everything and reacts to nothing. But before the next case was even called, I noticed something unusual in the room. There was a murmur in the gallery, not the normal whispering you hear when people are nervous about their own cases. This was different. Heads were turning. People were glancing toward the doors. The air felt charged, as if the room instinctively knew someone important, or at least someone who believed himself important, was about to walk in. Inspector Quinn looked up at me and gave me the smallest glance. He didn't need to say a word. After all these years, I can read that man's face as clearly as a printed page. That look said, "This one may require more than the usual." Then the clerk called the name, Richard Sterling, and the entire room went quiet. Now I had seen that name before, not in court records, in newspapers, in business magazines, on charity gala programs. Richard Sterling was one of those men who seemed to float above ordinary life. A CEO, a financier, a man whose net worth had more zeros than most families would see in 10 lifetimes. The kind of man who gives speeches about leadership from hotel ballrooms and has people applaud him for talking about discipline while others work double shifts just to keep the lights on. When he stepped up to the podium, he looked exactly like the kind of man the headlines had trained people to expect. Custom-tailored Italian suit, perfect tie, shoes polished to a shine, a heavy Swiss watch on his wrist that probably cost more than a used car. His posture was upright, but not in a humble way. He stood tall in the way of a man who has spent decades being told that every room improves when he enters it. What struck me wasn't the watch, it wasn't the suit. It wasn't the expensive cologne that seemed to arrive at the podium a moment before he did. It was his face. There was no embarrassment, no concern, no reflection, only irritation. He looked at me the way a man looks at a delayed flight. He looked at Inspector Quinn as if the officer were a minor inconvenience. Then he glanced toward the gallery, where ordinary working people were waiting for their own cases. And in that one brief sweep of his eyes, you could see the quiet assumption that he did not belong among them. That, my friends, is always the first sign of trouble. Not anger, not fear, contempt. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," I said. I gave him the chance every person gets in my courtroom. A simple greeting, a moment to acknowledge that no matter who you are outside those walls, inside that room, we begin with basic decency. He gave me a short nod. No, "Good morning, Your Honor." No courtesy, just a nod. It was small, but moments like that tell you everything. Respect is easy to show when it costs you nothing. The people who refuse to show it are usually the ones who have confused status with value. I opened the file and looked at the record. "Mr. Sterling," I said, "you are here today on two violations. The first is traveling 38 miles per hour in a 15-mile-per-hour school zone during active hours. The second is parking your vehicle in a designated handicap space in front of a pharmacy." I paused and let the facts settle into the room. Now, to some people, especially people who live in the world Richard Sterling lived in, these sounded like minor annoyances, nothing more than technical violations, paper problems, fees to be paid and forgotten. But the law isn't there to flatter your self-image, it is there to protect lives. A school zone is not an inconvenience, it is a place where small children trust that the adults driving around them value their safety more than their own schedule. A handicap space is not a suggestion. It is a lifeline for people whose day is already harder than most of us can imagine. I looked at him and asked the simplest question in the world. "Do you have an explanation for these actions?" He didn't hesitate, didn't lower his eyes, didn't look ashamed. He adjusted his cuff, exhaled softly, and spoke in the smooth, polished tone of a man who had spent most of his adult life talking his way into favorable outcomes. "Your Honor, I'm currently overseeing a multi-million-dollar merger. My phone had been ringing since 6 o'clock in the morning. I was running late for a board meeting. Quite frankly, the school zone sign was a distraction I didn't have time to focus on. As for the parking matter, I was only inside the pharmacy for 3 minutes to pick up a prescription. I didn't see the harm." There are moments in a courtroom when a person says more than they realize. That was one of those moments. He was not denying what he did. He was justifying it, and not with necessity, not with panic, not with some emergency involving a loved one. He was justifying it with importance, with wealth, with the assumption that his urgent life made ordinary rules negotiable. He was telling me, in the most polished language possible, that his time mattered more than the safety of children and more than the dignity of the disabled. The room went still. Inspector Quinn's posture stiffened slightly. The people in the gallery leaned forward in that almost invisible way people do when they realize they are no longer watching a hearing. They are watching a man reveal himself. Then Mr. Sterling reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a gold pen. Not a regular pen, a gold pen. Even now I can see it, the kind of object a man carries because he expects every problem in life to end with a signature. "My assistant is waiting outside with a checkbook," he said. "If the court would like, we can resolve this immediately. Just tell me the maximum fine." He said it the way a person might ask for the total at a restaurant. Quickly, efficiently, without emotional involvement. That is when the temperature in the room changed, because now it was no longer just a case about speeding and parking. Now it was about something deeper. He thought justice had a price tag. He thought the law was a transaction. He thought citizenship was something for ordinary people, and wealth was a separate category of existence. I looked at the pen. Then I looked at the man holding it. "Put the pen away, Mr. Sterling." He blinked, almost surprised. I don't think people tell men like that no very often. He lowered the pen slightly, but did not put it away. I leaned forward. "In this courtroom," I said, "we are not at a private club, and we are not settling accounts over lunch. You described a school zone as a distraction. Do you understand that what you are calling a distraction may be a 6-year-old child crossing the street with a backpack nearly bigger than they are? Do you understand that the handicapped space you occupied for 3 minutes may have been the difference between an elderly man entering that pharmacy safely and having to stand outside in pain?" His face tightened. He glanced once at his watch, almost automatically, as though somewhere deep in his mind he was still calculating whether this whole thing could be forced to move faster. That is the trouble with people who spend too much of life surrounded by privilege. They begin to think urgency is morality. They mistake their own busy schedule for virtue. They start believing that because they are in demand, they must also be right. I continued, "I don't want your money yet, Mr. Sterling. Money is the easiest thing for you to give. It asks nothing of you, no reflection, no humility, no change. A fine to a man of your wealth is not a punishment. It's a convenience fee. If the only consequence for breaking the rules is money, then those rules exist only for people with less money than you." That landed in the room the way truth often does, quietly but heavily. Some people in the gallery lowered their eyes. Others stared straight at him, because every person in that room understood exactly what I meant. A single mother scraping together rent money feels a parking fine. A wealthy executive does not. For one person, a ticket is anxiety, sacrifice, and maybe dinner skipped for a week. For another, it is background noise. That difference matters. I looked at Mr. Sterling and said, You are a leader, at least by title. You manage people. You influence decisions. But leadership without empathy is just well-dressed selfishness. And what I see standing in front of me right now is not a leader. I see a man who has forgotten what it means to share a community with other people. The frustration showed plainly now. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that. Men in his orbit probably thanked him for showing up. They probably laughed at his jokes, nodded at his opinions, and treated his presence as proof of importance. But the courtroom is one of the last places in this country where titles can still be stripped away in a single sentence. I turned slightly and looked toward Inspector Quinn. "Inspector," I said, "was there a reporting witness connected to the handicap parking incident?" "Yes, Your Honor." A woman stood up from the middle row. She wore a faded set of scrubs beneath a winter coat that had clearly seen many seasons. Her face looked tired in the way that doesn't come from one bad night's sleep. It came from a life of responsibility, a life of long shifts, short rest, and constant worry. Her name, I learned, was Mrs. Gable. She was not polished. She was not wealthy. She did not look like a person who had ever walked into a room expecting it to rearrange itself around her. She looked like someone who had spent too much of her life carrying burdens quietly. Inspector Quinn explained that Mrs. Gable had been taking her disabled father to pick up heart medication. The accessible space had been occupied by Mr. Sterling's vehicle. Because of that, she had to park farther away and help her father struggle through the cold. I turned back to Richard Sterling. "Turn around," I said. He frowned slightly. "I beg your pardon? You heard me. Turn around and look at the person whose 3 minutes you decided were worth less than your own." You could feel the resistance in him. Not physical resistance, but the resistance of pride. The resistance of a man who has spent years moving through life without having to directly face the consequences of his selfishness. But he turned. His eyes met Mrs. Gable's for barely a second. It was brief, but it was enough. Enough for him to see that this wasn't an abstract violation, not a painted symbol on asphalt, not a technicality. It was a real woman, a real father, a real mourning made harder because he had decided his own convenience mattered more. There is a phrase I have always believed to be true. A person's real wealth is measured not by what they can take, but by how much room they leave for others. I watched him closely. I wasn't looking for theater, not a public relations apology, not the kind of performance a lawyer coaches a client into delivering when cameras are present. I was looking for a flicker, a moment, a sign that beneath all that money and polish, there was still a human being left. Finally he spoke, but even then his instincts betrayed him. "Your Honor," he said, "I was not aware there was a specific individual affected. I'd be happy to compensate her for the inconvenience." Again with the money, again with the checkbook, again with the idea that dollars can erase what character created. I leaned forward. "Mr. Sterling, you keep reaching for your wallet as though it's the answer to everything. Is that how you live? Whenever you create inconvenience, whenever another person suffers because of your choices, you assume money can dissolve the matter. Let me make something very clear to you. This courtroom is not a machine where wealthy people insert cash and collect forgiveness." The gallery was absolutely still. Even the people who admired him in business pages would have had trouble admiring him in that moment. Because stripped of his wealth, he looked like what he really was, a man who had become spiritually lazy. Then I did something he did not expect. I said, "I am suspending the monetary fine on both violations." For just an instant, one tiny instant, I saw it. That smirk, that flicker of triumph. He thought he had won. He thought the old judge had finally bent. Thought maybe all that talk about principle had been a performance before I did what men with power expected the system to do. Then I continued. "Instead, Mr. Sterling, you are going to pay with something far more valuable to you than money. You are going to pay with time, with discomfort, with attention, and with the humility you have apparently not exercised in a very long while." The smirk vanished. Color drained from his face. To an ordinary person, a Saturday of service might sound manageable. To a man like Richard Sterling, whose identity seemed built entirely around control of his schedule, it landed like a hammer. "Next Saturday," I said, "you will report to the community center located 3 blocks from that pharmacy. You will spend 8 hours assisting elderly and disabled residents as they arrive for medication pickup and appointments. You will open doors, carry bags, help load equipment, wait in the cold, and while you do it, you will listen." A visible reaction moved through the room, not just surprise, shock. because the people in the gallery understood something immediately. This was not humiliation for spectacle's sake. This was correction. This was a sentence crafted to force a man out of abstraction and into humanity. Mr. Sterling opened his mouth. Your Honor, with all respect, my schedule... Your schedule, I said, is the reason you're standing in front of me. He swallowed. I have an international flight on Saturday evening. Then you can adjust it. This merger will survive you for one morning. He drew in a breath, now visibly unsettled. Your Honor, surely a charitable contribution or... No. The word hit like a door shutting. If you fail to appear at 8 o'clock in the morning, I said, I will hold you in contempt. And then you may spend your time somewhere much less comfortable than a community center. The choice is yours. Continue behaving like a wealthy man who believes himself above his neighbors, or begin learning how to be a citizen. The hearing ended there. But the story did not, because what happened on Saturday surprised even me. The morning arrived with that bitter New England cold that gets into your bones, the kind of weather that makes even ordinary errands feel heavier. The community center director later gave me a full report. At 8:03 a.m., Richard Sterling arrived. No chauffeur standing beside him, no assistant carrying coffee, no attorney. He was wearing casual clothes, but you could tell even his attempt at dressing down cost more than many people's monthly grocery bill. Over it all, the staff had placed a bright yellow volunteer vest. There are some images that tell a story better than words ever can. A millionaire in a neon safety vest is one of them. According to the director, his first 20 minutes were awkward, painfully awkward. He stood with the posture of a man trying very hard not to touch the reality around him. He was polite but stiff, helpful but distant, as though he were enduring something temporary and unpleasant, waiting for the clock to release him back into the world where people spoke his language. Then an elderly veteran named Mr. Henderson arrived. He drove an old truck and was trying to unload a wheelchair from the back. His hands shook badly, years of labor, age, illness, the kind of tremor life writes into your muscles after it has taken enough from you. For a moment, Richard Sterling just stood there. And I imagine in that moment his whole inner world was arguing with itself. One voice saying, "This is not your job." Another saying, "Yes, today it is." Then he stepped forward. He stabilized the chair, helped the veteran balance himself, walked him toward the entrance. Mr. Henderson looked up at him and said, "Thank you, son. Not Mr. Sterling, not sir, not CEO, just son." That one word probably cut through more armor than anything I had said from the bench, because titles only matter in rooms where people are impressed by them. Suffering has no interest in your resume. Over the next several hours, something began to happen. He started talking to people, really talking, not the way executives talk when they're collecting stories for speeches, not the way public figures talk when a camera is nearby. He asked questions, he listened, he helped Mrs. Gable's father with his medications. He walked with a man using crutches across an icy patch of pavement. He carried grocery bags for an elderly woman who apologized repeatedly for being a bother, the way too many decent people do when they've spent years being made to feel like an inconvenience. And slowly, the posture changed. The stiffness faded. The wall between him and everyone else grew thinner. Around noon, the director told me, a black SUV pulled near the lot. A woman from his social circle recognized him immediately. Fur coat, expensive sunglasses, the whole performance of elite life. She stared at him in open disbelief. You want to know the real prison of high society? It isn't the money. It's the fear of falling in front of your own kind. Those people can tolerate almost anything except visible humility. Apparently, Mr. Sterling looked shaken, not because of the work, because of being seen doing it. That is how deeply pride can own a person. It would rather be cruel in private than kind in public if kindness threatened status. But the work continued. Then came the real test. In the late afternoon, his phone kept vibrating. His attorney, his chief of staff, board members. There was some major gala that evening in Boston. The kind of event where wealthy people toast each other for their importance beneath chandeliers and call it community leadership. One of the calls, I later learned, was particularly direct. His lawyer told him they could challenge the sentence, paint him as a victim, claim judicial theatrics, get an injunction, have him out of there in time to save face at the gala. To a man like Richard Sterling, that call must have sounded like rescue. All he had to do was leave. All he had to do was return to the world where image mattered more than integrity. He stepped aside for a moment to take the call. His hands were smudged from helping fix a jammed walker and lifting equipment in and out of cars. When he hung up, he stood there looking across the parking lot. He saw Mr. Henderson waiting beside his truck. He saw Mrs. Gable trying to balance her father's bag and oxygen supplies. He saw people who had no influence, no status, and no leverage over his life. And for perhaps the first time in years, he understood the power of being needed by people who could offer him nothing in return. When his lawyer pressed him again, he answered with a sentence I will admit I did not expect. "Tell them I'm busy," he said. "I have real work to do." That sentence spread faster through Providence than any press release ever could. The wealthy were horrified. The ordinary were astonished. And I, sitting at my desk later that evening reading the report, felt something I do not feel lightly when it comes to people who arrive in my courtroom wrapped in arrogance. Hope, not certainty, but hope, because there is a difference. Some people become emotional for a day and return unchanged. Others encounter a single honest moment and never fully go back to who they were. Monday morning, the courtroom was packed. Word had gotten out. Reporters, spectators, society people, working people, people who came because they wanted to see a powerful man embarrassed, people who came because they wanted to see whether transformation was real. When Richard Sterling was called again to the podium, the room became silent. He was dressed sharply again. The suit had returned, the polished shoes had returned, but the man inside them was different. Gone was the impatient glance at the clock. Gone was the air of insulted importance. Gone was the gold pen. He stood with his shoulders lower, not defeated, simply human. I looked at the report in front of me. "Mr. Sterling," I said, "it appears you completed your assigned service. It also appears you stayed 2 hours beyond what the court required. You assisted multiple individuals after your shift should have ended. You helped Mr. Henderson repair a faulty heater in his truck. You spent additional time with Mrs. Gable and her father. I have one question for you." He looked up. "What did you learn that day that your boardroom could not teach you?" He took a breath, and when he answered, there was no polished speech in it, no public relations polish, no corporate phrasing. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I learned that I've spent years surrounding myself with people who make my life easier while becoming blind to the people whose lives are actually hard. I thought success meant efficiency, control, and speed, but I realized I've been moving too fast to see anybody. I've spent so much time building a life around importance that I forgot the value of being useful." No one moved. No one even coughed. He continued. "I looked at people I normally would have passed without noticing, and I realized they are the ones holding this city together. Nurses, veterans, caregivers, elderly people surviving each day with dignity, people who wait, people who struggle quietly, people whose lives are harder before most of us have had breakfast. I treated their time as smaller than mine. I treated their needs as background noise, and I was wrong. Now I will tell you something important. A courtroom can punish behavior. It cannot manufacture sincerity. That has to come from somewhere deeper." I watched him closely as he said those words, and I believed he meant them. Not because the story had gone public, not because cameras were present, but because humility has a different sound than performance. It is slower, cleaner, less eager to be admired. I nodded once. "Mr. Sterling," I said, "the law is satisfied. Your monetary fines are remitted. Your service has been completed. And I suspect the price you paid was greater than anything money could have purchased, and more valuable too. You are free to go." He could have walked out then, quietly, quickly, back to his life. Instead, he turned. Mrs. Gable was seated in the front row. He walked over to her, not with fanfare, not with cameras in mind, not reaching for a wallet. He held out his hand, and he said, "Thank you for the lesson, ma'am." No payment, no gesture of superiority, just gratitude. And that, in the end, was the real verdict. Because this case was never about traffic law. It was about a man who had mistaken privilege for worth. It was about the spiritual poverty that can settle into a person when the world keeps rewarding them without ever correcting them. And it was about something the powerful hate discovering, the fact that inside a courtroom and inside a community, they are not separate from the rest of us. They are accountable to the same moral gravity. That is what shocked high society so deeply about this story. It was not that a wealthy man got sentenced to community service. It was that he changed. They could have understood humiliation. They know that language well. What they could not understand was redemption through humility, because redemption requires something their world often avoids at all costs: honesty. As for me, I returned to work the next day as I always do. More tickets, more stories. More people walking in thinking they are being judged only for a violation, when really what they are revealing is a much deeper part of themselves. That is the sacred responsibility of a courtroom, not merely to punish, but to hold a mirror steady enough that a person can no longer look away. And if they are fortunate, if they are brave enough, sometimes they see themselves clearly for the first time. So when people ask me whether justice is about fines, rules, and consequences, I tell them this: justice is about memory. It reminds us who we are supposed to be to one another. It reminds the weak that they still matter. It reminds the powerful that they are not gods. And every once in a while, when the moment is right, it reminds a man in an expensive suit that a full bank account can never make up for an empty heart. Thank you for listening.